London, January 17th, 2008. British Airways Flight 38 is slowly coming in to land at Heathrow Airport after a long 12-hour flight. Everything seems completely normal. But suddenly, at 700 feet, both engines stop giving thrust. The pilots are pushing the throttles hard, trying everything they can, but nothing's working. The runway is right ahead. The weather is clear. Still, the plane is dropping fast. 500 feet. 300. They're really low now. Going too slow, and the runway is still far away. Alarms start blaring in the cockpit. The plane is getting closer to the 100-foot mark. Music. The lives of 136 people are about to be decided in just a few moments. Will the pilot be able to save this aircraft? Or will everything end before it even reaches the runway? Let's find out. This is the heart-stopping story of British Airways Flight 38. On the morning of January 17, 2008, British Airways Flight 38 was parked in Beijing, China. It had to cover about 1,100 kilometers and reach London in around 11 hours. The plane had landed in Beijing a few hours earlier and was now getting ready for the return trip. The ground crew was refueling. They were there. The engineers were checking the system, and every procedure was being completed normally. From outside, everything looked just like a routine flight. This was a Boeing 777, commonly called the 777. Built in 2001, the plane was about 7 years old at the time of the accident and had no major technical issues on record. It was equipped with two powerful Rolls-Royce Trent 895 engines, which were considered very reliable back then. The flight was commanded by 43-year-old Captain Peter Burkle, who had around 12,700 hours of total flying experience. It was about an hour-long flight experience. Out of that, he spent around 8,500 hours flying on the Boeing 777. With him was Senior First Officer John Coward, who had nearly 9,000 hours of experience, about 7,000 of which were on the same aircraft. The third pilot, Corner Magnus, was acting as the relief pilot on this flight. He had a total of around 5,000 hours of flight experience, including about 1,100 hours on the Boeing 777. On a long flight of nearly 11 hours, a relief pilot is present so the captain and first officer can cruise comfortably. The pilots took turns resting during the flight. When one pilot went on break, the relief pilot took over in the cockpit. This is a common practice on long international flights. Before the flight, all three pilots had a full 2 days of rest, so fatigue wasn't a factor in this incident. There were 13 crew members in the cabin looking after 136 passengers. For a large plane like the Boeing 777, this was a relatively small crew, which meant the plane was lighter than usual. A lighter plane generally performs better, so no one had any idea what was about to happen next. Hey friends, before we move ahead in the video, if you're even a little bit enjoying it, please make sure to hit the like button and subscribe to the Across Air channel. Now, let's get to that moment when everything was about to change. In the previous flight, this same plane had flown from London to Beijing. When it landed in Beijing, the fuel in its tanks was about 20 degrees Celsius. Before the return flight, when they refueled, the fuel temperature was still around 2 degrees Celsius. That means, right from the start of the flight, the fuel was already pretty cold. That was considered normal at the time because temperatures are expected to drop even more when flying at high altitudes. During the pre-flight briefing, the pilots carefully went over the flight plan. The plane was set to fly northeast over Russia's vast icy regions. Usually temperatures along this route at high altitude range between 50 to 60 degrees Celsius. But that day, the weather records were telling a different story. In some areas, temperatures were dropping as low as 70 degrees Celsius. It wasn't completely impossible, but definitely colder than usual. Because of this, the flight planning team decided to include step descents at intervals so the plane could fly at slightly lower altitudes from time to time, staying in relatively warmer air and preventing the fuel temperature from dropping too much. At the time, it seemed like just a cautious move. But later on, this cold would turn out to be the most crucial part of the whole story. Now the question arises, why does the outside temperature matter so much? After all, planes are built to withstand very cold temperatures. The plane's body, engines, and systems can operate in extremely low temperatures. The truth is that the danger isn't with the plane itself, but with its fuel. Jet A1 fuel, which is used in planes, starts to thicken around 4 degrees Celsius. It doesn't freeze solid but can get sticky and waxy. If that happens, the fuel filters and pumps can get clogged, cutting off the fuel supply to the engine. That's the real risk. However, the fuel doesn't get as cold as the outside air. The tanks inside the wings have systems that keep the fuel a bit warm. Plus, the cockpit has a fuel temperature warning system. When the temperature gets close to a dangerous level, the pilots get a warning and bring the plane down to a slightly lower altitude, where the air is relatively warmer. But here's an interesting thing. Outside temperature was reported to be as low as 70 degrees. Meanwhile, the fuel's freezing point is 44 degrees. So why doesn't the fuel freeze right away? It's because the plane is flying really fast. As it cuts through the air in front gets compressed, which raises its temperature a bit. So even if the outside static temperature is static 70 degrees, the actual temperature affecting the plane, the total air temperature is much higher, closer to around 35 degrees. It can be around 40. Now, there's another hidden factor here: water. Airlines do everything they can to make sure there's absolutely no water in the fuel. But the truth is, removing 100% of the water from fuel is almost impossible. Air keeps flowing in and out of the tank, and with it comes moisture. At high altitudes, when the temperature drops between 5 and 20 degrees, this water can turn into tiny ice particles. These particles can stick together and form bigger clumps. And if these ice clumps get stuck in a narrow part of the fuel system, then the path can get narrow or sometimes completely blocked. And since aircraft engines need a steady, consistent supply of fuel, if that supply drops, the engine power can suddenly fall, and in serious cases, the engine might even shut down. So the problem wasn't just the cold, it was ice building up in the wrong places. And if this happens at a critical time like landing, things can get really dangerous. That's exactly what was about to happen on this flight. Something no one had even imagined. The crew did a completely normal pre-flight check. Before takeoff, there was a detailed briefing, especially about the temperature issue. Everyone knew that extremely cold winds would be encountered along the way, so it was decided to keep a constant eye on the fuel temperature throughout the flight. All checks were completed. The plane was pushed back, taxied to the runway, and then at 10:09 Beijing time, with 136 passengers and about 79,000 kilograms of fuel, the Boeing 7777 took off, turned northeast, and started climbing into the sky. Shortly after, air traffic control requested crew to begin the initial. The cruise altitude climbed up to 35,000 feet. The plane started its climb to the initial cruise altitude. This climb was done in autopilot's weave mode. In this mode, the pilot sets in advance how fast the plane will climb, like 400 or 500 feet per minute. Then the system applies just enough thrust to maintain that rate. This method is considered more comfortable during cruise because the engines increase power gradually, so passengers barely feel any bumps. Throughout the journey, one important thing was constantly monitored: the fuel tank temperature. According to the records, it never dropped below 34 degrees Celsius. That was well above the freezing point of jet fuel. So, the crew in the cockpit were confident everything was within safe limits. As the plane flew over Russia and Northern Europe, its weight decreased because the fuel was burning. That's why a few hours later, while passing over Sweden, the plane was taken even higher, to about 40,000 feet. And then finally, it began its descent towards Heathrow Airport without realizing that the problem was just about to come up. About 40 minutes before landing, air traffic control told Flight 38 to enter a holding pattern at 11,000 feet northeast of London. Heathrow is one of the busiest airports in the world, so doing a few circles before landing is totally normal. At that time, the captain was flying the plane, but according to the original plan, the senior first officer was supposed to handle the landing. They were following a procedure called the monitored approach. This, one pilot flies the approach using the instruments, while the other keeps an eye outside for visual cues to take control at the right time and ensure a safe landing. The plane held in a holding pattern for about 5 minutes. After that, it was cleared to descend to 9,000 feet and then given clearance for an ILS approach to runway 27 left. The autopilot and auto throttle systems were working normally. At around 3,000 feet, when the plane broke through the cloud layer, the pilots could clearly see the airport. This flight started from Asia. The long flight was almost over. Everything seemed normal until the plane reached the last 1,000 feet, but something was about to happen in that final 1,000 feet that would put the entire plane at risk. By now, the plane was fully set for landing. The landing gear was down and the wing flaps were set at 30 degrees. The massive Boeing 777 was steadily descending towards the runway. The autopilot was still on, with plans to disconnect it around 600 feet for a manual landing. As the plane emerged from the clouds and the runway became clearly visible and control was handed over to the first officer. At the same time, there was a slight change in the wind. The speed fluctuated a bit, and the auto throttle adjusted thrust up and down 4 times to keep things balanced. But the 4th time it increased thrust, the plane was about 720 feet off the ground when the right engine started to spool down slowly. As the thrust dropped, the auto throttle tried to increase power on the left engine, but this time the engine didn't respond as expected. The plane was about 100 feet, and just as they descended, the left engine also started losing power. Moments later, the radio altimeter's automatic call-out sounded. The captain quickly confirmed that the approach was stable, and at the same time got landing clearance from the Heathrow Tower. The plane was now only about 30 seconds from the runway, but the tension in the cockpit had risen. Both engines were running just a bit above idle power, and the airspeed began to drop below the prescribed approach speed of 135 knots. The crew moved the thrust levers back and forth several times, but the engines didn't respond. Without enough airspeed, the wings... There wasn't enough lift to maintain the glide slope. The Boeing 777 started to slowly drop below the glide slope because the first officer hadn't disconnected the autopilot earlier. So, the automation tried to fix the situation. It raised the plane's nose and pushed the thrust levers forward. But since the engines weren't responding, this command actually made things worse. Raising the nose caused the airspeed to drop even more. This nearly 160-ton airliner had almost lost all available power. And now there was only one question left. Whether the plane would even make it to the runway, or if everything would end before that. To avoid putting too much strain on the engine, the auto throttle limited how fast the thrust levers could move, which made both levers look like they were in different positions. The left lever was ahead of the right one, which caught the first officer's attention. He couldn't figure out what he was seeing. He muttered quietly to himself like he was asking, "What is going on?" The captain called out, "Stabilized." Normally the first officer should have said, "Continue," but he replied hesitantly, "They reduced the throttle because they saw the airspeed starting to drop. There was no engine failure warning. Both engines were running and producing thrust, but it was very low, almost ineffective." The cockpit voice recording captured the crew discussing among themselves. Why were the engines at idle? They were quickly trying to figure out what the problem was. When the speed dropped to 100 knots, the low-speed master caution warning came on for the first time. And at that moment, the captain reacted a bit unusually. It was a decision that would make the situation even more critical. As soon as they recognized the overspeed warning. Immediately, they reduced the flap lever from 30 to 25. At the same time, they switched on the engine start switches and tried to start the APU to get some extra power. But by now, the plane's nose angle had gotten really high. As the speed neared a dangerous limit, suddenly the stick shaker warning went off. That's the system that alerts the pilot the plane is very close to stalling. As soon as the stick shaker activated, the first officer reacted right away. He pushed the nose down to avoid the stall. The autopilot immediately disconnected as soon as that happened. Now the plane was completely under manual control. The captain realized the situation was very serious. He quickly called a mayday on the radio. There was so little time that the cabin crew didn't even get a chance to warn anyone or tell passengers to assume the brace position. Nobody beyond the cockpit door had any idea what was about to happen in the next few seconds. Meanwhile, the plane was rapidly descending toward the ground. The first officer pulled back on the yoke to stop the fall, but the speed was too much. It was late, and the plane hit the ground about 330 meters before the left edge of runway 2, descending at roughly 1,400 feet per minute. The main landing gear touched down first. The plane bounced a bit. Then the right main gear broke off. As it came off, the plane bounced upward and tore a hole in the right side. It hit near row 30 in the cabin, where a passenger broke their leg. Despite the rough impact, the main structure of the huge Boeing 777 remained mostly intact. Several passengers and crew got minor injuries, but like a miracle, everyone on British Airways Flight 38 survived. Rescue teams arrived right after the accident. Around 9 ambulances and several officials came to the scene and took the injured to the hospital. For a while, all flights at the airport were stopped. But the biggest question was, how did such a modern plane lose power just before the runway? The low-speed warning and stick shaker in the cockpit were just the final signs. The real problem had started much earlier during the flight. The plane was a Boeing 777 with 3 fuel tanks. During the long cruise flight, the fuel temperature kept dropping in the extreme cold. Jet fuel doesn't freeze, but tiny water droplets in it turned into ice crystals. This ice gradually stuck to the walls of the fuel lines. Normally, this ice melts in the fuel oil heat exchanger. But on this flight, fuel flow remained low for a long time. So, the ice couldn't move forward and kept building up in the lines. When the plane reached near London and started its descent, the auto throttle increased the thrust. Suddenly, the fuel flow spiked, and right at that moment, the frozen ice broke loose and moved forward, getting stuck in front of the heat exchanger's mesh. That's where the real problem started. By the time the plane dropped below 1,000 feet, fuel supply to the engines had almost stopped. Engine power dropped, and the plane hit the ground before reaching the runway. After the investigation, it was clear the plane was badly damaged, so it was declared a total loss. This was the first major accident in the history of the Boeing 777. Later, in 2009, the plane was scrapped. It was changed. After the accident, both pilots were grounded for a while. After medical checks, they returned to duty. For bravery and quick thinking during the incident, all 16 crew members of the flight received the airline's highest honor, and maybe that's the most remarkable thing about this event. Such a huge accident. Such a big plane. Yet every passenger and crew member on British Airways Flight 38 survived. If this incident made you think, be sure to watch the next video about Emirates Flight 47's near-death experience. Got really close. Click here to watch the full video, and I'll see you there in a second.